This tutorial will discuss aeronautical decision-making. Aeronautical decision-making, ADM, is decision-making in a unique environment, aviation. It is a systematic approach to the mental process used by pilots to consistently determine the best course of action in response to a given set of circumstances. It is what a pilot intends to do based on the latest information he or she has. The importance of learning and understanding effective ADM skills cannot be overemphasized. While progress is continually being made in the advancement of pilot training methods, aircraft equipment and systems, and services for pilots, accidents still occur. Despite all the changes in technology to improve flight safety, one factor remains the same: the human factor, which leads to errors. It is estimated that approximately 80% of all aviation accidents are related to human factors, and the vast majority of these accidents occur during landing, 24.1%, and takeoff, 23.4%. ADM is a systematic approach to risk assessment and stress management. To understand ADM is to also understand how personal attitudes can influence decision-making and how those attitudes can be modified to enhance safety in the flight deck. It is important to understand the factors that cause humans to make decisions and how the decision-making process not only works but can be improved. For over 25 years, the importance of good pilot judgment, or aeronautical decision-making, ADM, has been recognized as critical to the safe operation of aircraft, as well as accident avoidance. The airline industry, motivated by the need to reduce accidents caused by human factors, developed the first training programs based on improving ADM. Crew Resource Management, CRM training for flight crews, is focused on the effective use of all available resources, human resources, hardware, and information supporting ADM, to facilitate crew cooperation and improve decision-making. The goal of all flight crews is good ADM, and the use of CRM is one way to make good decisions. Research in this area prompted the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, to produce training directed at improving the decision-making of pilots, and led to current FAA regulations that require that decision-making be taught as part of the pilot training curriculum. When tested, the pilots who had received ADM training made fewer in-flight errors than those who had not received ADM training. The ADM process addresses all aspects of decision-making in the flight deck and identifies the steps involved in good decision-making. Steps for good decision-making are: 1. Identifying personal attitudes hazardous to safe flight. 2. Learning behavior modification techniques. 3. Learning how to recognize and cope with stress. 4. Developing risk assessment skills. 5. Using all resources. 6. Evaluating the effectiveness of one's ADM skills. While poor decision-making in everyday life does not always lead to tragedy, the margin for error in aviation is thin. Since ADM enhances management of an aeronautical environment, all pilots should become familiar with and employ ADM. While CRM focuses on pilots operating in crew environments, many of the concepts apply to single-pilot operations. Many CRM principles have been successfully applied to single-pilot aircraft and led to the development of Single-Pilot Resource Management, SRM. SRM is defined as the art and science of managing all the resources available to a single pilot prior and during flight to ensure the successful outcome of the flight. SRM includes the concepts of ADM, risk management, RM, task management, TM, automation management, AM, controlled flight into terrain, CFIT awareness, and situational awareness, SA. SRM training helps the pilot maintain situational awareness by managing the automation and associated aircraft control and navigation tasks. This enables the pilot to accurately assess and manage risk and make accurate and timely decisions. SRM is all about helping pilots learn how to gather information, analyze it, and make decisions. Although the flight is coordinated by a single person and not an onboard flight crew, the use of available resources such as air traffic control, ATC, and flight service station, FSS, replicates the principles of CRM. Two defining elements of ADM are hazard and risk. Hazard is a real or perceived condition, event, or circumstance that a pilot encounters. When faced with a hazard, the pilot makes an assessment of that hazard based on various factors. The pilot assigns a value to the potential impact of the hazard, which qualifies the pilot's assessment of the hazard, risk. Hazardous attitudes and antidotes. Being fit to fly depends on more than just a pilot's physical condition and recent experience. For example, attitude will affect the quality of decisions. Attitude is a motivational predisposition to respond to people, situations, or events in a given manner. Studies have identified 5 hazardous attitudes that can interfere with the ability to make sound decisions and exercise authority properly. Anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. Hazardous attitudes contribute to poor pilot judgment but can be effectively counteracted by redirecting the hazardous attitude so that correct action can be taken. Recognition of hazardous thoughts is the first step toward neutralizing them. After recognizing a thought as hazardous, the pilot should label it as hazardous, then state the corresponding antidote. Antidotes should be memorized for each of the hazardous attitudes so they automatically come to mind when needed. During each flight, the single pilot makes many decisions under hazardous conditions. To fly safely, the pilot needs to assess the degree of risk and determine the best course of action to mitigate risk. For the single pilot, assessing risk is not as simple as it sounds. For example, the pilot acts as his or her own quality control in making decisions. If a fatigued pilot who has flown 16 hours is asked if he or she is too tired to continue flying, the answer may be no. Most pilots are goal-oriented, and when asked to accept a flight, there is a tendency to deny personal limitations while adding weight to issues not germane to the mission. For example, pilots of helicopter emergency services, EMS, have been known more than any other groups to make flight decisions that add significant weight to the patient's welfare. These pilots add weight to intangible factors, the patient in this case, and fail to appropriately quantify actual hazards, such as fatigue or weather when making flight decisions. The single pilot who has no other crew member for consultation must wrestle with the intangible factors that draw one into a hazardous position. Therefore, he or she has a greater vulnerability than a full crew. Several risk assessment models are available to assist in the process of assessing risk. The models, all taking slightly different approaches, seek a common goal of assessing risk in an objective manner. Mitigating risk. Risk assessment is only part of the equation. One of the best ways single pilots can mitigate risk is to use the IMSAFE Checklist to determine physical and mental readiness for flying. Illness. Am I sick? Illness is an obvious pilot risk. Medication. Am I taking any medicines that might affect my judgment or make me drowsy? Stress. Am I under psychological pressure from the job? Do I have money, health, or family problems? Stress causes concentration and performance problems. While the regulations list medical conditions that require grounding, stress is not among them. The pilot should consider the effects of stress on performance. Alcohol. Have I been drinking within 8 hours? Within 24 hours? As little as 1 ounce of liquor, 1 bottle of beer, or 4 ounces of wine can impair flying skills. Alcohol also renders a pilot more susceptible to disorientation and hypoxia. Fatigue. Am I tired and not adequately rested? Fatigue continues to be one of the most insidious hazards to flight safety, as it may not be apparent to a pilot until serious errors are made. Eating. Have I eaten enough of the proper foods to keep adequately nourished during the entire flight? The PAVE Checklist. Another way to mitigate risk is to perceive hazards. By incorporating the PAVE Checklist into pre-flight planning, the pilot divides the risks of flight into 4 categories: pilot and command, PIC, aircraft, environment, and external pressures, PAVE, which form part of a pilot's decision-making process. With the PAVE checklist, pilots have a simple way to remember each category to examine for risk prior to each flight. Once a pilot identifies the risks of a flight, he or she needs to decide whether the risk or combination of risks can be managed safely and successfully. If not, make the decision to cancel the flight. If the pilot decides to continue with the flight, he or she should develop strategies to mitigate the risks. One way a pilot can control the risks is to set personal minimums for items in each risk category. These are limits unique to that individual pilot's current level of experience and proficiency. One of the most important concepts that safe pilots understand is the difference between what is legal in terms of regulations and what is smart or safe in terms of pilot experience and proficiency. P is pilot in command, PIC. The pilot is one of the risk factors in a flight. The pilot must ask, am I ready for this trip in terms of experience, recency, currency, physical, and emotional condition? The IMSAFE Checklist provides the answers. A is aircraft. What limitations will the aircraft impose upon the trip? Ask the following questions. Is this the right aircraft for the flight? Am I familiar with and current in this aircraft? Can this aircraft carry the planned load? V is environment. Weather. Weather is a major environmental consideration. Earlier, it was suggested pilots set their own personal minimums, especially when it comes to weather. As pilots evaluate the weather for a particular flight, they should consider the following. What are the current ceiling and visibility? In mountainous terrain, consider having higher minimums for ceiling and visibility, particularly if the terrain is unfamiliar. Consider the possibility that the weather may be different than forecast. Have alternate plans and be ready and willing to divert should an unexpected change occur. Are there any thunderstorms present or forecast? If there are clouds, is there any icing current or forecast? What is the temperature dew point spread and the current temperature at altitude? Terrain. Evaluation of terrain is another important component of analyzing the flight environment. Airspace. Check the airspace and any temporary flight restrictions, TFRs, along the route of flight. E is external pressures. External pressures are influences external to the flight that create a sense of pressure to complete a flight, often at the expense of safety. Factors that can be external pressures include the following: the desire to demonstrate pilot qualifications, the desire to impress someone. Probably the 2 most dangerous words in aviation are "watch this." The pilot's general goal completion orientation. Emotional pressure associated with acknowledging that skill and experience levels may be lower than a pilot would like them to be. Pride can be a powerful external factor. Management of external pressure is the single most important key to risk management, because it is the one risk factor category that can cause a pilot to ignore all other risk factors. The pilot's goal is to manage risk, not create hazards. Operational pitfalls. Although more experienced pilots are likely to make more automatic decisions, there are tendencies or operational pitfalls that come with the development of pilot experience. These are classic behavioral traps into which pilots have been known to fall. More experienced pilots, as a rule, try to complete a flight as planned. The desire to meet these goals can have an adverse effect on safety and contribute to an unrealistic assessment of piloting skills. These dangerous tendencies or behavior patterns, which must be identified and eliminated, include the operational pitfalls shown in the figure. Stress management. Everyone is stressed to some degree almost all of the time. A certain amount of stress is good since it keeps a person alert and prevents complacency. Effects of stress are cumulative, and if the pilot does not cope with them in an appropriate way, they can eventually add up to an intolerable burden. Performance generally increases with the onset of stress, peaks, and then begins to fall off rapidly as stress levels exceed a person's ability to cope. The ability to make effective decisions during flight can be impaired by stress. There are two categories of stress: acute and chronic. There are several techniques to help manage the accumulation of life stresses and prevent stress overload. For example, to help reduce stress levels, set aside time for relaxation each day or maintain a program of physical fitness. To prevent stress overload, learn to manage time more effectively to avoid pressures imposed by getting behind schedule and not meeting deadlines. Use of resources. To make informed decisions during flight operations, a pilot must also become aware of the resources found inside and outside the flight deck. Since useful tools and sources of information may not always be readily apparent, learning to recognize these resources is an essential part of ADM training. Resources must not only be identified, but a pilot must also develop the skills to evaluate whether there is time to use a particular resource and the impact its use will have upon the safety of flight. Situational awareness. Situational awareness is the accurate perception and understanding of all the factors and conditions within the 5 fundamental risk elements: flight, pilot, aircraft, environment, and type of operation that comprise any given aviation situation that affect safety before, during, and after the flight. Maintaining situational awareness requires an understanding of the relative significance of all flight-related factors and their future impact on the flight. When a pilot understands what is going on and has an overview of the total operation, he or she is not fixated on one perceived significant factor. Not only is it important for a pilot to know the aircraft's geographical location, it is also important he or she understand what is happening. To maintain situational awareness, all of the skills involved in ADM are used. Obstacles to maintaining situational awareness. Fatigue, stress, and work overload can cause a pilot to fixate on a single perceived important item and reduce an overall situational awareness of the flight. A contributing factor in many accidents is the distraction that diverts the pilot's attention from monitoring the instruments. Workload management. Effective workload management ensures essential operations are accomplished by planning, prioritizing, and sequencing tasks to avoid work overload. As experience is gained, a pilot learns to recognize future workload requirements and can prepare for high workload periods during times of low workload. In addition, a pilot should listen to ATIS, Automated Surface Observation System, or Automated Weather Observation System if available, and then monitor the tower frequency or Common Traffic Advisory frequency to get a good idea of what traffic conditions to expect. Recognizing a work overload situation is also an important component of managing workload. The first effect of high workload is that the pilot may be working harder but accomplishing less. As workload increases, attention cannot be devoted to several tasks at one time, and the pilot may begin to focus on one item. When a pilot becomes task-saturated, there is no awareness of input from various sources, so decisions may be made on incomplete information and the possibility of error increases. When a work overload situation exists, a pilot needs to stop, think, slow down, and prioritize. It is important to understand how to decrease workload. Therefore, placing a situation in the proper perspective, remaining calm, and thinking rationally are key elements in reducing stress and increasing the capacity to fly safely. This ability depends on experience, discipline, and training. Please help us spread the word about Pilot Training System, and we look forward to further servicing your flight training needs.